Phone activity, like the drugs I just mentioned, nicotine, heroin, alcohol, cocaine, releases dopamine in our brains in the same manner, making us feel aroused, motivated, happy. And this pathway of activation is similar to drugs, right? When you're feeling more connected or validated, or really just interacting through the phone, your dopamine is being released constantly. You're getting an influx. All right, we have a crisis looming. It's on the horizon, and it's got to do with dopamine. Our receptors are tired, real tired, from the overload and stimulus of dopamine in our bodies. Now, dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it's made from the amino acids tyrosine and phenylalanine. And like all neurotransmitters, they're chemical messengers between brain cells or neurons. And we know it as our reward molecule. It makes you feel alert, motivated to do things, really happy. It's a molecule that motivates us to achieve and obtain things, right? Without dopamine, we'd just be sitting like a blob on the floor or on the couch, right? It's the thing that motivates us to get up and accomplish and do. So think of an activity that you know is pleasurable for you, right? Say it's your favorite food, eating your favorite food, right? And we can visualize it. You can smell it, you can see it, right? For me, it's this vegan pizza from this place in New York, right? And I could see it, and it's glistening, right, with all that damn oil. And it's inviting, the colors, right? The crust, I can even smell the crust, I can hear the crust. I can feel it in my body, right? My mouth begins to salivate. And the neurotransmitters effect on me, dopamine, when it's flooding my body through this visualization, is going to be the very thing that gets me to get up and go, you know what? I gotta get to New York and I gotta get me one of them pizzas and to buy a ticket and to fly on an airplane and then to go to New York for a pizza. I won't be doing that, but that is a neurotransmitter that is driving us to do and accomplish. The craving, right? That's a thing. So dopamine is characterized by basically this. It's something you think of or experience, and you're motivated to want more. And you experience that and you feel good and you're flooded with that reward of more dopamine, like, oh, yes, I'm taking the first bite of this pizza and I could smell all the smells and hear all the New York City cabs honking and everything. I'm back. And then that's reinforced for you to do that in the future again. So aside from this characteristic, it's also creating more pleasure and reward, right? It's the whole motivation part of it. Dopamine also has a role in other things in our body. In movement, fluid movement. Low levels of dopamine are associated with Parkinson's disease. And if you've seen someone with Parkinson's, my grandfather had it. I remember when I was little, I would see his hand always shaking and he would shuffle his feet. And I would always wonder what's happening with his movements. Well, what happened was his dopamine was low, right? And it goes to the dopaminergic receptors in the part of the brain. But you also see things like restless leg syndrome associated with it. Also, dopamine is connected to memory, behavior and cognition, attention, sleep, right? Good deep sleep and arousal, mood, especially low levels of dopamine are associated with depression and even schizophrenia, learning, and lactation, actually, right? So it's one of the dopamine pathways, the sole dopamine pathway that is not associated with reward, is associated with lactation. But it also can act like a hormone in the body, meaning that it has far-reaching effects all throughout the system. It's implicated in proper blood flow, in our digestion, executive functioning, right? How we making decisions throughout our day in our brain, those complex decisions and decision making. Heart and kidney function, memory, focus, as I mentioned before, and then mood and emotions, as I was talking about. And believe it or not, it even has a role, as I mentioned, digestion, but pancreatic function and even insulin regulation. So dopamine is an essential neurotransmitter that when it's balanced, we feel balance. As you see, it's not just brain, focus, reward, cycle, but it's more expansive. So the more balanced our dopamine, the healthier we are. Now we are feeling the effects of too much constant release of dopamine in our body. When you have too much dopamine, it can lead all the way into mania, hallucinations, and delusions. But here's what happens with us. We get a tidal wave of dopamine, we're flooded with it, and then boom, it crashes, and then we're depleted with it. There's no consistent flow, right? We're not a sailboat on a sea of ease waves, right? Just flowing through the ocean. Instead, we're seeing a tidal wave. We're really up high towards the sun, and then we're coming right back down, and we're on this crazy cycle of tidal wave to crash, tidal wave to crash. And because of it, it's not only affecting our mental health, it's affecting our physical health. So let's talk more about the things that really deplete our dopamine first. Lack of sleep. This is going to disrupt your dopamine automatically, especially the receptors. We have Nora D. Volkow, right? She's a director at the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. And Volkow done a lot of research and spoken a lot about the effects of sleep and dopamine and how they connect together. She says sleep deprivation, it will affect your dopamine system. It's going to affect how you regulate alertness and overall brain function, right? MRI and PET scans that we see on sleep-deprived human subjects were seen to lack proper dopamine transmission. So the brain cells were, yes, releasing dopamine into the body, but the adjacent neuron, it wasn't receiving it, right? So we're trying to release dopamine, but ain't nobody there to receive it. And that's what happens when our sleep is becoming more and more deprived. And a lot of us are becoming deprived for sleep. And for me, it's one of the root things that is affecting our dopamine, and I'll talk a little bit about it more on the phone. But that blue light is really, really disrupting our sleep and our behaviors and our lifestyle. She says, when people are sleep deprived, they're less likely to regulate their desires and engage in impulsive behaviors, right? Because our dopamine is out of whack. And what we see is impulsivity. What else affects our dopamine? I feel like I'm going to be speaking to a lot of American culture, right? The United States, obesity. So many of us are suffering from obesity. So obesity creates deficiencies in dopamine synthesis and release. They affect the dopamine receptors. And dopamine disruption may actually be at the root of the obesogenic cycle. So the D2 receptor, what they saw was decreased in obese individuals in proportion to their BMI. So usually what we see is due to diet, it induces changes affecting the dopamine system and leading to physical inactivity. So it's starting with that poor diet that's really affecting the whole dopamine system, the receptors, the synthesis, and then it's creating physical inactivity. So really interesting stuff, because dopamine, as you'll see, becomes more and more sensitive to things that we're exposing it to every day. So we have the power with sleep and how we control our diet, which I'll go into a little bit more later, and how our BMI looks, right? How we're controlling our muscle to fat ratio. Also an article titled Brain Dopamine and Obesity, it was published in The Lancet, quoted, dopamine modulates motivation and reward circuits, and hence dopamine deficiency in obese individuals may perpetuate pathological eating as means to compensate for decreased activation of these circuits. Again, the food affecting our dopaminergic system, right? And then leading to behaviors that increase or perpetuate the obesity, right? Like pathological eating, which is crazy, right? How sensitive dopamine is to inputs like food. Well, what else affects dopamine? Drugs. Now, it's a big reason why they're so addictive is because its effect on dopamine. Some, like nicotine, heroin, and alcohol being the most dangerous drug of all, create a tidal wave that increase our dopamine so we feel rewarded and want more, right? And the latter two have a larger increase than the former, right? The alcohol and the heroin. But still, all of those are increasing our dopamine. Others, like cocaine, actually keep the dopamine signal in on mode the whole time, so it's always reactivated. Not all of us are taking drugs all the time. But what is a drug that is affecting us on the same mechanism in our body that we're exposed to every single day? And it's ubiquitous, and it's so popular, and it's the phone. Phone activity, like the drugs I just mentioned, nicotine, heroin, alcohol, cocaine, releases dopamine in our brains in the same manner, making us feel aroused, motivated, happy. And this pathway of activation is similar to drugs, right? When you're feeling more connected or validated, or really just interacting through the phone, your dopamine is being released constantly and you're getting an influx. Dr. Anna Lemke, the world expert on addiction and the author of Dopamine Nation, well, she calls phones the modern day hypodermic needle. She says, we've forgotten how to be alone with our thoughts. We're forever interrupting ourselves. And as she puts it, for a quick digital hit, which is constantly releasing dopamine in our body, meaning we rarely concentrate on the taxing tasks for a long term that get us into that creative flow, but also give us that work to reward connection that is a more natural on pace evolutionary standard, which we evolved with, right? So every spare second, we're having an opportunity to be stimulated, right? And our constant need for gratification is causing our attention to go down and our dopamine to continue flooding our body, which is causing a drug-like reaction. So Lemke says we're losing our capacity to delay gratification, solve problems, and deal with frustration and pain in many different forms. But because of this rush of dopamine, especially early on in children, we're seeing downstream effects like ADHD, childhood aggression, behavioral problems, right? Because they're developing early on with screen and screen time. The more screen time, the more dopamine and the more dysfunction down the road. Children's brains are craving more dopamine while producing less dopamine naturally, right? So we're not self-regulating, and that surge is just coming and coming, and it's making it harder for us to experience peace and joy from natural experiences which are releasing dopamine. And tech companies know this and they're taking advantage of it. And because of that, our dopamine is becoming depleted and we're really facing a really big dopamine issue. So with that said, what helps dopamine? Now it's important to distinguish. There's a difference between what helps balance and synthesize and create and restore natural healthy levels of dopamine versus what overactivates it. We have to understand, right? Stimulating dopamine is in two different ways makes two different results. When we're overactivating it, it's things like video games, right? Shopping, constantly shopping, recreational drugs, as I was talking about, sugar, porn, right? Gambling, all those addictive behaviors, thrill-seeking behaviors, all those things that happen and we constantly expose ourselves to it unnaturally, and we're flooded with these unnaturally high levels of dopamine. And it's stimulating our dopamine, reducing the breakdown, right? But we want to make sure that we are naturally producing it and helping our body regulate and re-regulate itself. So, what are some ways naturally to help restore dopamine? Well, first and foremost, move away from the things that are unnaturally shooting out those tidal waves of dopamine, right? And I would start with the phone. You have to understand there is a cost to having a phone, right? Aside from the monetary output, we have to understand the cost is especially in our brain chemistry. So for me, there's a deal. If you have a phone, you have to dedicate yourself to dopamine detox, period. If you have a phone, you have to dedicate yourself to dopamine detox. It's part of the deal of having a phone, right? So if you have a phone, you have to make sure, especially in the morning and especially at night, you've dedicated that time to reduce that flood of dopamine, help restore balance in your body, give those receptors some peace for a change, right? Help them rejuvenate and restore, especially when you sleep. So no phone in the morning, no phone at night, at least an hour. And then you got to do a dopamine detox. Take one day out of the week, preferably one day out of the week, if not one day out of the month. Take your phone, lock it up, don't use it for a day. Your brain and your body is going to thank you. I promise you, you're going to feel completely different. And you're going to see how powerful dopamine is in your overall health. Cold water helps regulate dopamine. Right? So it activates dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. These are upregulated when you're getting into cold water. One study in the European Journal of Applied Physiology looked at human physiological responses to immersion into water at different temperatures. What did they find? 57 degrees, to be exact, raised people's blood levels of neurotransmitters, adrenaline by 530%, which comes down, and dopamine by 250%. Which is a great first step to raise up your dopamine naturally in the day. So I just mentioned getting off your phone in the morning, not being on it, and then when you're done after or closing in on that hour, get into the cold. Take a cold shower, 57 degrees or lower. If you have a cold tub, even better. Get in a cold tub, 48 degrees or lower. Stimulate that dopamine naturally, and then you can put on your day blockers and then get on your phone. Make sure you're not looking at that blue light all day, especially if you're going to be in front of the computer. So get off that dopamine, but make sure you're introducing it naturally. What else? Getting enough sleep. We know these things raise and boost dopamine levels naturally. You want to make sure you get enough sleep. You want to exercise. These are all evidence-based interventions that really show how dopamine can be increasing in the body for the positive. Guess what? Listening to music. You ever listen to music and you go, damn, that song is good, and you get the chills, or you really feel that music? That's dopamine being released, right? So listening to music that is really resonant with you, something that is coherent to you, is going to be really powerful at naturally stimulating dopamine. Meditating, actually. An hour of meditation is going to increase your dopamine by 65%. Spending time in the sun, we see more dopamine receptor concentration in people who spend more time in the sun. This can all raise dopamine levels in a healthy way. What else? Making sure you eat, and I just mentioned early on, the amino acids, tyrosine and phenylalanine, the two amino acids that go into making dopamine, right? So there's animal products if you eat animal products, but also apples, avocados, bananas, beans, legumes, beets, chocolate, green leafy vegetables, nuts, oats, olive oil. This is why variety is really important. Oregano, peanuts, rosemary, sea vegetables, sesame and pumpkin seeds, soy, turmeric, watermelon. Fava beans actually have L-dopa, the precursor to dopamine, right? So you want to make sure you're getting enough of these foods as well, while getting out of the unnatural tidal wave exposers and creators of dopamine, right? You also want to support your body in dopamine synthesis with minerals and vitamins, right? Things like iron, copper, zinc, niacin, folate, B6, vitamin D, essential fatty acids. They're all important in creating dopamine in the body. They're cofactors as well. What else? Support your gut bacteria. We know gut bacteria will help make serotonin and help aid in digestion. I mentioned dopamine has a role in digestion too. Gut bacteria create dopamine. Giving yourself prebiotic foods, Jerusalem artichoke, garlic, onions, asparagus, green leafy vegetables, apples, all of these prebiotic foods are going to be helpful while eating fermented foods as well. Whichever ones that you prefer, look into that. Google them both if you never heard it. I speak about it a lot. All right, low levels of dopamine, you'll see. Especially when you crash. Remember I talked about being in the sea and hitting that tidal wave and coming back down? You're gonna feel tired, you're gonna feel moody, you're gonna feel unmotivated, which is a big thing that a lot of people used to come to me in clinic for, saying they have a lack of motivation. In many ways, we don't even see how it goes hand in hand with our overusage and increased screen time. The more you're on your phone, the less motivated you're gonna be for anything. Touch and human connection, dopamine's released through hugs, dopamine's released when you're petting a dog. Also practicing delayed gratification. This is something that's really hard, especially for the youth, because we're so used to wanting something, ordering it, getting it, wanting something, looking it up, finding it out. But delayed gratification helps us go back into that evolutionary experience of how we experience dopamine, right? We had a task, a job, an experience, and then we were rewarded with the result, and then we went back and did something else and rewarded with the result. But there was always a time differentiation. There's an unnatural closing of that experience where we have the problem, the situation that we want to solve, and experience a gratification really fast. And for that, it's bringing down our attention span as well. So there you have it. I'm calling it now. In the year 2022, we are looking on the horizon and seeing a major, major issue that is coming forth. And I can see right on the horizon, and I'm standing right at the shoreline, and there's a tidal wave coming, and it is a tidal wave of people with dopamine dysregulation. And a lot of us are suffering already. And if you feel tired or moody or unmotivated or any of the symptoms of low dopamine, know that one, you can control it. Two, your phone is probably one of the biggest agents of dopamine disruption and dysregulation. And three, we can help restore it naturally. So follow these recommendations, see how you feel. Chances are you'll feel great. And if it works for you, send it to someone you love and start spreading this.